The night is moonless over the Persian Gulf, and aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, the deck crew moves with practiced urgency under red light illumination that preserves night vision while Super Hornets are repositioned for potential launch. In the Combat Information Center 3 decks below, radar operators watch screens filled with contacts, electronic signatures from Iranian coastal defense sites pinging across the Strait of Hormuz, while intelligence updates stream in from satellites 22,000 miles overhead and from submarine reconnaissance much closer to shore. The air is thick with tension that has become routine here, a contradiction that defines this theater where the world's most powerful military faces an adversary it cannot simply overwhelm. 1,200 miles away in Tehran, in a fortified command facility beneath the capital, Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders study their own displays, tracking the American carrier group's movements, calculating launch windows and coordinating with coastal missile batteries, knowing that their nation's survival depends not on matching American power, but on making any conflict so costly, so unpredictable, so regionally catastrophic that Washington will hesitate before the first shot is fired. This is the strategic reality that has defined U.S.-Iran relations for decades, a confrontation that emerged from the ruins of the 1979 revolution when students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and held 52 hostages for 444 days, severing a relationship that had made Iran a key American ally in the Middle East and transforming it into what successive administrations would call an adversary, a rogue state, a member of an axis of evil. The 8-year war with Iraq in the 1980s hardened Iran's military doctrine, teaching its commanders that they could not compete with conventional forces, but must instead embrace asymmetric warfare, proxy networks, ballistic missiles, and later drones as force multipliers that could threaten American interests without requiring the industrial base that produces aircraft carriers and stealth bombers. American sanctions followed, waves of them across administrations both Democratic and Republican, targeting Iran's economy, its oil exports, its banking sector, its ability to acquire advanced military technology, creating a siege economy that forced Tehran to develop indigenous weapons programs and deepen relationships with Russia, China, and non-state actors across the region. The nuclear program became both Iran's strategic deterrent and the focal point of international diplomacy, with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action briefly offering relief before the Trump administration withdrew and maximum pressure returned, leaving both nations locked in a cycle of escalation and restraint that has brought them repeatedly to the brink without quite tipping over. Understanding the military balance requires examining what each side brings to the table, starting with American advantages that are staggering in their scope and technological sophistication. The United States military operates with a global reach that no other nation can match. 11 aircraft carrier strike groups that can project power anywhere on Earth within days, each carrier accompanied by guided missile cruisers and destroyers equipped with Aegis combat systems capable of tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously and engaging them with precision that was science fiction a generation ago. American air superiority is built on platforms like the F-35 Lightning II stealth fighter, which can penetrate contested airspace while remaining invisible to most radar systems, and the F-22 Raptor, which dominates air-to-air combat with thrust vectoring and sensor fusion that allows pilots to see the battlefield in ways their adversaries cannot. The bomber fleet includes B-2 Spirits that can strike anywhere in the world from bases in Missouri, their stealth characteristics allowing them to evade detection while delivering precision-guided munitions or, if the unthinkable occurs, nuclear weapons from the American arsenal of approximately 3,800 deployed and reserve warheads maintained as part of a nuclear triad that also includes submarine-launched ballistic missiles and ground-based intercontinental missiles. American space-based surveillance provides real-time intelligence gathering through optical and radar satellites, communications networks that cannot be easily disrupted, and GPS navigation that makes precision warfare possible even in denied environments. Cyber capabilities are equally formidable, with the NSA and Cyber Command possessing tools to penetrate adversary networks, disrupt command and control systems, and potentially shut down critical infrastructure from electrical grids to financial systems to industrial control networks that manage everything from refineries to water treatment plants. The logistics infrastructure supporting American military power is perhaps the most underappreciated aspect of its dominance, with pre-positioned equipment in multiple theaters, aerial refueling tankers that extend the range of combat aircraft by thousands of miles, and a military sealift command that can move entire brigades with their vehicles and supplies across oceans. American bases ring the Middle East, from Qatar, where Central Command is headquartered, to Bahrain hosting the Fifth Fleet, to Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean serving as a strategic logistics hub, each position carefully chosen to ensure rapid response and sustained operations. The defense industrial base produces weapons systems at a scale and sophistication that dwarfs all competitors, from Tomahawk cruise missiles that can strike targets 1,500 miles away, to guided artillery shells accurate within meters, to electronic warfare systems that can jam or spoof enemy communications and sensors. American military spending approaches $900 billion annually, more than the next 10 nations combined, funding not just platforms and personnel, but research and development that maintains technological advantages in artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, directed energy systems, and quantum computing applications that will define 21st century warfare. Yet for all this overwhelming conventional superiority, Iran has spent 4 decades developing capabilities specifically designed to exploit American vulnerabilities and impose costs that might deter intervention or make military victory Pyrrhic at best. Iranian doctrine explicitly rejects symmetrical confrontation in favor of asymmetric strategies that leverage geography, proxies, missiles, drones, and swarm tactics to create multiple dilemmas for American planners. The ballistic missile arsenal is the most obvious manifestation of this approach, with Iran possessing perhaps 3,000 missiles of varying ranges and capabilities, from short-range weapons that can strike Saudi Arabia and Israel to medium-range systems like the Shahab-3 and Ahmad that can reach targets 1,800 kilometers away with warheads, potentially weighing up to a ton. These missiles are mobile, dispersed across the country, hidden in tunnels carved into mountains, and moved on transporter-erector launchers that can set up and fire within minutes, making them nearly impossible to destroy preemptively. Iranian engineers have improved guidance systems over the years, achieving circular error probable measurements that have shrunk from kilometers to tens of meters, demonstrated when missiles struck the Ain al-Assad airbase in Iraq in January 2020, in retaliation for the killing of Qasem Soleimani, hitting specific buildings and aircraft shelters with accuracy that surprised American intelligence assessments. The drone program represents perhaps Iran's most cost-effective military investment, with unmanned systems ranging from small surveillance quadcopters to Shahed-136 loitering munitions that can be launched in waves to overwhelm air defenses, each costing perhaps $20,000, while forcing adversaries to expend interceptors worth millions. The September 2019 attack on Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq oil processing facility demonstrated the potential of this approach when drones and cruise missiles temporarily knocked out half of Saudi oil production, penetrating defense networks built and maintained at enormous cost and revealing vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure that no amount of money seems able to fully protect. Iran has transferred drone technology to proxies across the region, from Hezbollah in Lebanon to Houthi forces in Yemen, creating a distributed strike capability that can threaten American interests and allied nations from multiple directions simultaneously, complicating defense planning and stretching already limited air defense inventories. Geography provides Iran with advantages that no amount of American technology can entirely negate, as the mountainous terrain offers natural defensive positions and makes invasion extraordinarily difficult, while the long coastline along the Persian Gulf and the critical choke point of the Strait of Hormuz create economic leverage that extends far beyond military considerations. The strait is just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, through which passes approximately 1/5 of global oil trade and a significant portion of liquefied natural gas exports from Qatar and the UAE, making it possibly the most strategically important waterway on Earth. Iranian coastal defense forces maintain anti-ship cruise missiles like the Russian-supplied Yakhont and indigenous systems like the Khalij Fars, which use ballistic trajectories to strike naval targets, along with thousands of naval mines that could be deployed to close the strait or at minimum make transit so dangerous that insurance costs become prohibitive, and shipping companies seek alternate routes that do not exist at sufficient scale. The Revolutionary Guard's naval forces operate hundreds of small, fast attack craft armed with rockets, torpedoes, and anti-ship missiles, designed not to defeat the U.S. Navy in conventional battle, but to swarm American warships in confined waters where superior American technology matters less than it would in open ocean. Each small boat potentially carrying explosives for suicide attacks, reminiscent of the USS Cole bombing in 2000, when 17 American sailors died from a single explosive-laden boat in a Yemeni port. Iran's strategic depth comes not just from its own territory, but from proxy networks cultivated over decades of investment and ideological alignment, creating what Iranian strategists call the axis of resistance, spanning from Tehran through Iraq and Syria to Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, with additional influence over Shia militias in Yemen and elsewhere. Hezbollah represents perhaps the most capable of these proxies, possessing an arsenal estimated at 150,000 rockets and missiles, sophisticated air defense systems, anti-tank guided weapons, and combat experience from years fighting in Syria that has transformed it from a guerrilla organization into a force capable of combined arms operations. In any conflict between the United States and Iran, Hezbollah could open a second front against Israel, launching rocket barrages that would overwhelm Iron Dome defenses through sheer volume and potentially striking critical infrastructure including chemical plants and the Dimona nuclear facility, forcing Israel to respond with devastating firepower against Lebanon and potentially drawing the United States into a wider regional war. Iraqi militias loyal to Iran control territory adjacent to American bases and embassy facilities, demonstrated through periodic rocket attacks that have killed contractors and threatened diplomatic personnel, while possessing the capability to escalate significantly if Tehran gives the order. The Houthis in Yemen have already demonstrated their willingness to attack Saudi Arabia and have threatened international shipping in the Red Sea, showing how Iranian proxies can stretch American forces and attention across multiple theaters simultaneously. Iran's cyber capabilities have grown substantially over the past decade, with attacks attributed to Iranian actors targeting American financial institutions, with distributed denial-of-service attacks, attempting to breach industrial control systems at a dam in New York, and successfully compromising networks at Saudi Aramco in 2012 with the Shamoon virus that destroyed data on 30,000 computers. While Iranian cyber capabilities remain inferior to American or Chinese equivalents, they are sufficient to cause significant disruption to critical infrastructure, financial systems, and government networks, particularly if coordinated with kinetic attacks to create confusion and slow response times. The relative anonymity of cyber operations allows Iran to conduct ongoing harassment below the threshold that might trigger military retaliation, probing American networks for vulnerabilities while building tools and access that could be activated in a crisis. The strategic calculus governing U.S.-Iran relations exists in this context of asymmetric capabilities and mutual vulnerability, where American military superiority is undeniable, but Iranian capacity to inflict costs is equally clear. Consider how conflict might actually unfold, starting with the scenario that has long haunted Pentagon planners, which is Iranian closure or attempted closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The trigger could be an American or Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, or Iranian retaliation for an assassination of a senior Revolutionary Guard figure, or miscalculation during one of the periodic confrontations between American and Iranian naval forces in the Gulf. Iran announces that the strait is closed to all traffic and begins laying naval mines while coastal missile batteries go on high alert and fast attack craft swarm toward shipping lanes. American commanders face an immediate dilemma because clearing mines is time-consuming and dangerous work requiring specialized vessels that are vulnerable to Iranian anti-ship missiles and suicide boats, while the global oil market responds instantly with prices potentially doubling or tripling within days as traders price and supply disruption from the Gulf. The Fifth Fleet responds with carriers launching strikes against Iranian coastal defense sites, while submarines fire Tomahawk cruise missiles at Revolutionary Guard naval bases and command facilities, achieving immediate tactical success in destroying targets with minimal American casualties. But Iranian mobile missile launchers that survived the initial strikes retaliate by targeting American warships with ballistic missiles and swarm attacks by dozens of fast boats, force escorts to expend ammunition at alarming rates defending against low-tech threats. The regional picture deteriorates rapidly as Iranian proxies activate across multiple fronts simultaneously. Hezbollah begins launching rockets toward northern Israel, forcing Israel to evacuate hundreds of thousands of civilians from border areas and respond with airstrikes against Lebanon that inevitably cause civilian casualties and international condemnation. Iraqi militias attack American bases with rockets and car bombs while attempting to overrun the embassy in Baghdad's Green Zone, forcing emergency evacuations and reinforcement by Marines while simultaneously dealing with the Gulf crisis. The Houthis fire ballistic missiles toward Saudi oil facilities and attack tankers in the Red Sea with mines and anti-ship missiles, forcing insurance companies to suspend coverage for the region and effectively halting maritime trade not just through the Strait of Hormuz, but through adjacent waterways. Oil prices reach unprecedented levels, triggering recession in energy-importing nations, while gasoline shortages and rationing begin in countries without sufficient strategic reserves. Stock markets crash globally as investors flee risk assets, credit markets freeze as counterparty risk becomes impossible to assess, and supply chains that depend on just-in-time delivery collapse as manufacturers cannot obtain components or ship finished goods. American air superiority allows strikes deep into Iranian territory against leadership targets, nuclear facilities, military bases, industrial sites, and energy infrastructure. But Iranian missiles continue launching from mobile platforms and hardened tunnels that satellites cannot locate and bunker-busting munitions cannot always reach. The Iranian electrical grid is targeted with cyber attacks that cascade into failures across interconnected systems, plunging cities into darkness and disabling water treatment and communications. But American infrastructure experiences similar attacks as Iranian cyber units and their proxies activate pre-positioned malware in American utilities, financial institutions, and government networks. Civilian casualties mount in both nations, though asymmetrically, as American precision weapons still kill Iranian civilians when intelligence is imperfect or when targets are located in populated areas, while Iranian weapons are less accurate and more indiscriminate when they reach their intended targets at all. The international community fractures along familiar lines, with European allies supporting American actions rhetorically while seeking diplomatic off-ramps that might end the conflict, Russia and China condemning American aggression while providing Iran with intelligence and potentially covert military assistance, and regional actors like Turkey and Pakistan trying to maintain neutrality while managing refugee flows and economic collapse. The nuclear dimension hovers over everything, never quite explicit but impossible to ignore, as intelligence agencies assess whether Iran has covertly achieved breakout capacity to produce weapons-grade uranium and assemble a crude device despite decades of denial and monitoring. American planners must consider whether devastating strikes on Iranian leadership and military capabilities might prompt a desperate decision to activate a hidden weapons program, or whether an Iranian device exists and might be transferred to a proxy organization willing to use it against Israel or smuggled into an American city, scenarios that seem far-fetched until the alternative explanations for certain intelligence fragments become even less plausible. Israel conducts its own assessment independent of Washington and may reach different conclusions about risk tolerance and timing, potentially launching preventive strikes without American approval that expand the conflict in ways the United States had hoped to avoid. Pakistani nuclear weapons become a concern, as political instability there raises questions about weapons security and whether Iranian influence with certain military and intelligence factions might create opportunities for material or knowledge transfer that even Pakistani leadership cannot fully control. After weeks of sustained combat, both sides face difficult realities that war planners had anticipated but political leaders had hoped to avoid. American military forces have achieved every tactical objective, destroying Iran's conventional military capabilities, decimating its naval forces, cratering its air defenses, and striking leadership and command facilities with devastating effect. But Iran continues functioning as a state, and its decentralized command structure allows continued asymmetric operations through proxies and remaining missile forces. American casualties remain relatively low by historical standards, perhaps several thousand killed across all theaters. But the political tolerance for losses is much lower than during previous wars, and images of flag-draped coffins arriving at Dover Air Force Base erode public support for continuing operations. The monetary cost approaches several $1 trillion when including direct military expenses, economic disruption, allied assistance packages, and long-term commitments to regional security, while American infrastructure suffers from cyber attacks that will require years and hundreds of billions to fully repair. Iranian casualties number in the tens of thousands of military personnel and perhaps similar numbers of civilians. Its economy lies in ruins with GDP contracting by half or more. But the regime survives by blaming foreign aggression and rallying nationalist sentiment, while regional proxies remain capable of sustained harassment even if they cannot achieve strategic victory. The Strait of Hormuz becomes nominally navigable again as American forces clear most mines and establish air supremacy that suppresses overt Iranian threats. But insurance costs remain prohibitive, and shipping companies route around Africa rather than risk transit through a region where Iranian sleeper cells might attack vessels or where remaining mines could sink ships without warning. Global oil production adjusts over months as other producers increase output and strategic reserves are drawn down, but prices remain elevated compared to pre-conflict levels, and energy dependence becomes a political liability for every government unable to provide cheap fuel to constituents facing economic hardship. The regional order fragments as traditional American allies question Washington's judgment and reliability, having watched their own economies devastated by a conflict they did not choose, while Iranian influence persists despite military defeat. Saudi Arabia and the UAE quietly begin diplomatic engagement with Tehran, recognizing that accommodation may be necessary with a neighbor that cannot be destroyed, no matter how many American bombs fall. Turkey expands its regional role as a mediator and power broker, filling spaces left by American retrenchment and European distraction. Russia and China deepen their partnerships with Iran, providing reconstruction assistance in exchange for long-term economic concessions and strategic access that tilts the regional balance away from American interests. The humanitarian consequences manifest slowly but devastatingly across the region, with refugee flows numbering in the millions as Iranians flee economic collapse and continued instability. Lebanese escape Israeli bombardment and Hezbollah reprisals. Iraqis abandon cities caught between American forces and Iranian militias, and Yemenis suffer from intensified fighting and complete breakdown of what little governance existed. Neighboring countries with their own economic problems cannot absorb these populations, leading to sprawling refugee camps where disease spreads, extremist organizations recruit among the desperate, and generational trauma takes root that will shape the region for decades. The medical system collapses across multiple countries as hospitals are damaged or overwhelmed, pharmaceutical supply chains are disrupted, and sanctions prevent importation of essential medicines. Famine conditions develop in areas where conflict disrupts agriculture and where coastal cities depend on food imports that no longer arrive. The environmental damage includes massive oil spills from damaged tankers and pipelines, burning wells and refineries releasing toxins, and conventional munitions contaminating soil and water with heavy metals and explosive residue. The long-term strategic outcomes remain uncertain years after active combat ends, depending on decisions made in capitals from Washington to Tehran to Beijing about how to manage what neither side can claim as victory. The United States emerges with its conventional military dominance reaffirmed, but its appetite for Middle East intervention thoroughly exhausted, leading to drawdowns in regional presence and pivot toward perceived threats from China that had been delayed by the Iran conflict. American technological advantages widen further as defense budgets prioritize artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, directed energy systems, and cyber capabilities, seen as essential for near-peer competition, while lessons from Iranian asymmetric tactics inform planning for potential conflicts with adversaries who might employ similar approaches. The dollar's role as global reserve currency faces renewed questions after weaponization of the financial system against Iran demonstrated to other nations the risks of dependence on American-controlled payment systems, accelerating efforts to develop alternatives through digital currencies and bilateral trade arrangements that bypass Western institutions. American politics become even more polarized as debates over the war's necessity and execution deepen existing divisions, with some arguing that stronger initial action would have deterred Iranian resistance, while others contend the entire conflict was avoidable through diplomacy and sanctions relief. Iran emerges physically devastated, but politically vindicated in the eyes of its leadership, and supporters who argue that resistance prevented total capitulation and prove that asymmetric strategies can impose costs that deter future American intervention. The regime consolidates power by blaming economic hardship on foreign aggression while purging internal dissidents who had hoped military defeat might create opportunities for political change. Iranian nuclear ambitions either accelerate in secret with determination that only weapons provide true deterrence, or are abandoned as impractical given the destruction of facilities and international monitoring that any reconstruction agreement would require. The missile and drone programs receive renewed investment as the only proven means of threatening adversaries who possess overwhelming conventional advantages, with technology transfers to proxies increasing as Tehran seeks to maintain regional influence despite reduced capacity for direct military action. Iranian society fractures between those who accept the official narrative of victorious resistance and those, particularly among younger urban populations, who see only wasted lives and opportunities in service of ideologies they do not share, creating tensions that might eventually challenge the regime despite its survival of external threats. The global balance of power shifts in ways that extend far beyond the Middle East, as other nations draw lessons about American reliability, the utility of asymmetric capabilities against superior conventional forces, and the risks of escalation in an interconnected world where regional conflicts become global economic crises within days. China observes carefully how American forces performed and where they struggled, adjusting its own military development and contingency planning for Taiwan accordingly, while accelerating efforts to secure energy supplies through pipelines and partnerships that avoid maritime choke points where American naval power could enforce blockades. Russia benefits from higher energy prices and expanded influence in the Middle East, positioning itself as a necessary partner for regional stability that Washington can no longer provide alone. European nations recognize their vulnerability to disruptions in Middle East energy supplies and refugee flows, leading to increased defense spending but also to foreign policies that prioritize stability over ideological alignment with American positions. India faces difficult choices about maintaining partnerships with both Washington and Tehran, seeking to preserve energy access and regional influence while managing domestic political pressures and strategic competition with China that requires American cooperation. The prospect of future U.S.-Iran conflict will be shaped by whether either side believes it can achieve objectives through military means that could not be secured through other approaches. American advantages in conventional military power remain overwhelming and are likely to increase as new technologies enter service. But the demonstrated costs of regional conflict and limits of what military force can achieve create powerful incentives for restraint. Iranian capacity for asymmetric resistance remains substantial despite losses, but the economic and humanitarian costs of confrontation with the United States offer their own lessons about the risks of escalation. The nuclear question persists as the unresolved issue that could override all other calculations, with scenarios where either Iranian acquisition of weapons or credible international belief that acquisition is imminent might trigger preventive action, despite the costs that prior conflict demonstrated. Regional proliferation becomes more likely if Iran crosses the nuclear threshold, with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt all possessing the resources and technical capability to develop weapons programs if they conclude that regional security requires them, creating a cascade of instability that would make the Middle East even more volatile and increase the probability of nuclear use somewhere in the world. Diplomatic solutions remain theoretically possible through various frameworks that address Iranian security concerns, nuclear program constraints, sanctions relief, regional influence, and American interests in preventing proliferation and terrorism. But the domestic political constraints in both nations make compromise extraordinarily difficult. Iranian hardliners see any accommodation with the United States as betrayal of the revolution and surrender of sovereignty, while American political dynamics reward tough rhetoric toward Iran and punish anything perceived as appeasement or weakness. The generational transition in Iran's leadership may eventually create opportunities as younger figures less invested in revolutionary ideology gain influence, but this process will take years, and the direction remains uncertain. American domestic politics might shift if economic costs of Middle East involvement become unsustainable or if great power competition with China creates imperatives to reduce commitments elsewhere. But this too depends on electoral outcomes and policy debates that cannot be predicted with confidence. The realistic assessment of U.S.-Iran military balance acknowledges American conventional superiority while recognizing Iranian capacity to impose substantial costs through asymmetric means, creating a deterrence relationship that neither side can confidently predict surviving the stresses of actual combat. The United States possesses every advantage in platforms, technology, logistics, global reach, and destructive capacity capable of devastating Iran's military and infrastructure while suffering relatively limited losses by historical standards. Iran cannot defeat the United States in conventional battle, but can survive military assault while imposing economic chaos through disruption of energy supplies, activating proxy networks across multiple theaters, inflicting casualties through asymmetric attacks, and potentially forcing conflicts that last years rather than weeks with no clear path to victory. The strategic calculus suggests that both sides lose from major conflict, with American costs economic and political while Iranian costs are economic, political, humanitarian, and potentially existential. Yet miscalculation remains possible when both sides believe their threats are credible and their resolve will not be tested, until suddenly it is tested, and neither can back down without appearing weak. The global implications of US-Iran conflict extend far beyond the bilateral relationship or even the Middle East region, affecting energy markets, financial systems, military alliances, nuclear proliferation, and great power competition in ways that reshape international order. The United States faces questions about whether its military power can achieve political objectives against adversaries who choose asymmetric resistance, about the sustainability of global commitments when regional conflicts can spiral into economic crises, and about the credibility of extended deterrence when allies observe the costs and limits of American military intervention. Iran faces questions about whether resistance ideology serves national interests or condemns successive generations to isolation and hardship, about whether asymmetric capabilities provide genuine security or merely delay inevitable accommodation with more powerful adversaries, and about the price paid by ordinary citizens for decisions made by revolutionary elites. The world faces questions about whether the post-Cold War American-led order can persist, whether rising powers will challenge regional security arrangements through military means or negotiate new frameworks, and whether nuclear proliferation can be contained when states conclude that only weapons provide reliable deterrence against powerful adversaries who might otherwise impose regime change. In the darkness of the Persian Gulf, the radar screens still show contacts and the missiles remain ready, and commanders on both sides know that decisions made in the next crisis might lead to consequences that neither fully anticipates, with outcomes determined not just by the balance of military capabilities that can be counted and assessed, but by the human judgment and luck and circumstance that no documentary can predict and no analysis can fully capture, leaving both nations suspended in a confrontation that neither can win, but that either might lose if the deterrence that has held for decades finally fails when the next provocation comes, and someone somewhere decides that action is preferable to continued waiting, and the first shot is fired into a situation that both sides thought they controlled until they discover that nobody controls war once it begins.